Well, great. So I want to welcome everyone to this webinar, and also a special welcome to our guest, Mark Truss, who is not only a faculty member at NYU's School of Professional Studies, teaching in our integrated marketing program, but also is the Chief Research Officer of Wunderman Thompson. And I'm looking forward to a really healthy, good debate, as we always seem to have when we're together, about many things, a lot of new experiences we've all been working through and dealing with. But Mark has led some very interesting research on the state of anxiety in America today. And I've asked him if he would share that at first, and then we'll get into a conversation. So over to you, Mark.
Great, Michael, thank you. Always good to see you and chat with you, and hello, everyone. Michael, host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, we'll fix that. Make host, there we go.
I am now the host, okay. All right, so as Michael was saying, we completed some research recently about COVID-19. Specifically, what we were looking at is something that we call the anxiety index, which is something we've been tracking for a fairly long time, about 17 years. This was a piece of quantitative research. So a survey-based methodology surveyed 500 people across the United States aged 18 plus. This sample is representative of that US population. And this was conducted just at the end of March. You may ask yourself, why would anyone want to be tracking anxiety? And the reason we track anxiety is that we learned many years ago that there's an inverse relationship between the anxiety of consumers and the Consumer Confidence Index as tracked by the Conference Board, which means that as anxiety increases among people, consumer confidence decreases and spending patterns therefore change. So we've been tracking this for a fairly long time. Obviously now is an interesting time to look at this and important for brands. A couple of things we've noticed, I'm just going to pull out a few of the highlights here, is most Americans, when you ask them, are you feeling anxious or not, there's a pretty high baseline level of people feeling at least even somewhat anxious in America today, with a little bit of spikes along the way, but not too much. Where we tend to see the big difference is the people who report being very anxious in a certain period of time. And when we look at what drives those peaks of anxiety, certainly it's, global events or national events that upset the status quo. But the other big driver is presidential elections in the US tend to get people anxious. And we think that's largely because candidates often use fear as a platform and a cudgel to get people to vote for them. So when they do that, you see these spikes, people respond, and you see these spikes in anxiety. The thing we're seeing that's really different at this time than we've ever seen before, and again, we've tracked this for 17 years, is that usually we only see one of these categories spiking at a time. And in fact, it's almost like a game, I describe it as a game of like whack-a-mole. As one anxiety increases, the other anxieties recede. And as one of those receded anxieties pops up, the original anxiety goes down. So there's only, we always thought it was sort of like Americans had the bandwidth for one major anxiety at a time. And as you can see in this chart, we're in uncharted waters, because for the first time we have three anxieties all spiking at the same time at about the same level. So health obviously is the pandemic people are worried about. Economic is obviously the economy and people losing jobs and all that. And then the third one is the government, and this is partly partisanship, but partly a lack of people's confidence that the government can get us through this. So we've never seen this before. And it almost says to us that, a lot of the past lessons we've learned about how to weather a crisis from a marketing point of view, they may or may not apply directly nowadays, just because we've never seen a situation quite like this. And just to show you that, to give you a sense of that whack-a-mole idea I was talking about, if we look at one of those categories, social anxieties, and what people were anxious about 3 years ago compared to today, so those orange bars are 3 years ago, you can see across the board, everyone's saying, you know what, not too anxious about that right now. Thank you. We've got bigger fish to fry. Another thing that we see in here, right, and people trying to put it in their own words, is we get this sense from people that the world seems crazier than ever before, and it feels like the world is coming apart at the seams. And I do think that's somewhat a function of the fact that people feel like this is coming at them from so many different directions that they're having a difficult time even processing it. And somewhat, this was just sort of an interesting little bit, people say, the media is playing a role in this, and that in some ways people are getting addicted to what's the latest news on this, and it's feeding that anxiety. I just saw a piece of data from Express Scripts, one of the companies that processes prescription data, and their data was showing that between February 15th and March 15th, the number of prescriptions filled, new prescriptions for anti-anxiety drugs, increased 34% in this country. That's a staggering number. These are med categories that are rock solid. They never change. In fact, they've been declining a little bit. To see that kind of change, again, I think it dovetails with this data and supports what's going on. This was a very interesting finding to us. When we look at age of Americans and how anxious people are, the group that is the most anxious are the youngest people, 18 to 24-year-olds. And my first thought when I saw that is that doesn't make sense, because we see pictures of them flouting social distance guidelines and partying at spring break on the beach. What are they nervous about? They don't seem to be so nervous. But what's really driving their anxiety is not so much COVID-19. It's the economy. And it's, these are young people, probably college-age students starting out in their careers and trying to figure out, gee, is there going to be a job for me when I get at it, when we get through this? How am I going to pay back my student loans? All these kind of very practical but economic considerations about the crisis. We also see that in general, women tend to be more anxious than men. And actually in the Express Scripts data, we saw the same phenomenon, that most of those prescriptions were for women. And we also see that, again, the chart on the right showing the anxiety levels about COVID-19 by political ideology. And you see that liberals significantly more concerned about COVID-19 in the government than conservatives, and moderates falling somewhere in between on that spectrum. But this says that there is a lot of partisanship going on. People are feeling it, and partly what they're hoping is that that doesn't hinder the government's ability to get us through this crisis. The big question everyone's asking is, how long is this going to last? When is this going to end? And, Michael and I are recording this on April 17th. Just yesterday, the president was encouraging those states that can to reopen for business, right? With a smart, staged approach. That's a little out of step with what the average American is feeling. They're feeling like this isn't going to be done till the June-July period. They're looking at another 3 to 4 months of this. So it's just an interesting tension between what the government is trying to do, and what the citizens are feeling about. This was just one piece of information that I thought was quite interesting, because in the run-up to this crisis, there was a lot of discussion, especially in the media, about how coronavirus is just like the seasonal flu, and it's going to have the same impact on people, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not how people feel. When we ask them, how dangerous do you think a number of different viruses are, coronavirus people think is significantly more dangerous than the seasonal flu. This chart, I know there's a lot on here. This is actually a chart I would never tell my students to present a chart like this, but I was trying to get a lot into one story. But to me, what's interesting about this chart is we were asking people how nervous or anxious they are about specific aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. And the thing that comes up at the top is disrupting their daily life. And what's interesting is when you look at the specifics of that, what does that really mean? Are you going to run out of the products that you use? Are you going to disrupt your family's normal routine? The internet won't be able to handle everyone online. You're going to run out of food. You're going to have vacations. Like, what are the practical aspects of what disrupting daily life means? Those are actually much lower on this chart than just this overall concept of disrupting daily life. So there's almost this sense of what people are fearing is the fear itself, right? To butcher FDR's line. And we see the same thing with on the financial side, is that people are focused on the macroeconomic issues, the economy crashing, but they're less concerned about some of the more microeconomic issues. And I'm assuming as the crisis wears on, that will balance out a bit. But at the outset of this, people are really, I think the reason they're not getting into the weeds of the specifics is that they're very overwhelmed and don't really know how to process this. If I had to say what's driving all of this anxiety, what the data is saying is it's the uncertainty that's driving the anxiety. This was an interesting question. We asked people how much of a role, if any, should each of the following organizations play in getting through the crisis and halting the spread of coronavirus. Interestingly, the number one is people saying it's us. We have to do this, right? The CDC has to do their job. The government has to do their job, doctors and nurses. But at the end of the day, we all have to listen and participate in social distancing and do the right things to get us through this. Again, there's a lot of data on here, and it wasn't intended for you to look at this data in this detail, but we were trying to gauge the level of knowledge people actually have about coronavirus. And we could ask people, how knowledgeable are you about coronavirus? But it's not a great way to ask a question, because we don't know how people are assessing their own knowledge level and whether they're right about that. So we actually gave them a quiz. We said to them, hey, here's a list of statements. Some of these statements are true statements about coronavirus, and some of these statements are false statements. And just so you know, these false statements I took from notoriously disproven COVID-19 conspiracy theory type things. And then we graded them to see how well they did. And on average, Americans get like a C+, which I know you guys watching know, not a great grade, right? But what was troubling to me more so was that their average grade on the true statements was a B, not bad. And their average grade on the false statements was a C, which means that there's a lot of misinformation going on out there, and people are believing it. And this is probably a whole nother discussion Michael and I will have one day about trust in institutions and media and social media and the implications of that on society. And it's interesting when you look at who does better and worse on this little test. Women have a better understanding of COVID-19 than men do. Older Americans have a better understanding, more accurate understanding than younger people. Interestingly, suburbanites have a better understanding than urban and rural. I think we all have this perception that people who live in urban areas are better educated, more sophisticated, but we're not seeing that in this case. And interestingly, when we look at how anxious people are about COVID-19, we see a difference in how much they know about it. People who are very anxious about COVID-19 know more about it than the people who aren't. And it begs the question, does being anxious force one to become more informed, or does being less knowledgeable about COVID-19 allow one to live blissfully happily? But it would suggest to me that maybe getting educated about this is not a bad thing. We asked people, what are the things, the actual behaviors people should be doing to halt the spread of coronavirus? And then what are the things you're actually doing? So the orange bars are the things they should be doing, and the blue bars are the things they are actually doing. And what you can see, and again, if you're in the integrated marketing program, you know this is a truth, that even though people know they should be doing something, real behavior change is a very difficult thing to get people to do, and people struggle with doing it. And you can see the gap between what they should be doing and what they are doing. From a branding point of view, people, 9 out of 10 people said, the one at the bottom, the government alone can't stop this spread. We need companies to help out too. It's too big of a problem, and we need those trusted companies to help. And if companies do help and take action, they will gain the admiration of consumers, which suggests this is a time when companies shouldn't be retrenching from communicating with their consumers. They should be front and center and part of this process. And then just lastly, we looked at, a lot of people are asking this question. A lot of behaviors have changed during the quarantine period. People are doing things very differently. And the big question is, well, which of those are going to be sticky and stay around post-crisis, and which of those will probably go away and will return back to what we always did? Most of these behaviors, avoiding vaccines, avoiding restaurants, not going to the movies, minimizing culture. Most people feel like I'm probably just going to go back and do what I did before. The behaviors that have the most sticking power, interestingly, are more person-to-person social interactions, right? So frequently washing one's hands, washing them for the full 20 seconds, not shaking hands when you meet someone. These are ones that people think, these might live on past the crisis and become a new social norm, at least in America. And some behaviors do have specific impacts on businesses. Grocery retail could have a big impact, and a positive impact, maybe, depending on how they handle it, which is people hoarding and stocking up on goods. Remote learning and remote working may be something that people feel will stick around. A lot of organizations have dipped their toe into remote working, and now everyone's doing it, right? And I think we're learning a lot about how it works, and we're also learning that for the most part, it seems to be working well. And then cruise ship companies, obviously, I think people often had a sense that maybe they weren't the healthiest place to be because of the close quarters, and that there's no open space on them. And now I think people are really feeling that. So they're going to have to do some major industry work to fix that reputation. So those are kind of the highlights. There's more to it than that, but I figured as a starting point, we would share those, and then we can have a discussion about what some of the implications are of those.
Sounds fantastic. Okay, well, thank you for sharing. I'm going to see if I can reclaim the host from you, which you may get a message.
Do I have
I
to
need
do
to
that?
do. I think I'm the host. Yep, I'm good. No, I got
Okay.
it back. I got
Okay.
it back. So, well, I mean, some really interesting food for thought there, including a lot. Obviously, our lens is mostly around brands and marketing and communications more generally, in terms of how companies should be thinking about positioning themselves both now in the immediate moment and then longer term for the future. And I think perhaps I want to start with talking a bit about the future and where you see potentially some of these trends netting out. So you have, you've outlined at least a number of areas where people have told you that they think that certain habits they've adopted during COVID-19 are going to stick. And I guess my question to you is using the lens of a lot of experience of situations like this occurring, going away, consumers reacting. How will we know, or what might be the markers of what are really profound changes in consumer behavior and consumer thinking? How will we know what are just temporary, and how will we be able to determine maybe that they're different, but they're not significant? Yes. So do you see any shifts, big, real, profound shifts in how people relate to each other, relate to brands, etc.?
Not as it relates to brands, no. I think as it relates to products, yes, but less so brand. I mean, it's an interesting thing because we've noticed over time that advertising, marketing, actually serves a secondary role in society more broadly, right? So obviously it has a commercial role, but its other role is that it signifies normalcy to people. It is the normal course of events. It's part of what we deal with. And when marketers change their tone too much in a crisis like this, that actually adds to people's anxiety. What people want in a time like this is they want reassurance, and they want brands that they know and love, right? I mean, Coca-Cola is sort of like your grandparent, right? It's a known, loved entity, and people want and have a need to have it around because it attenuates that anxiety right now. So from a from a product point of view, I think there will be differences. It's interesting because there's always the old um, concept of in a recession, you see an uptick of lipstick, right? That's sort of been the marketer's mantra for
Right, right.
years. They're not seeing it this time around. They're seeing a huge plunge in cosmetics and lipstick. And, it's probably because they can't go out and get it easily, and they're
Hmm.
not people aren't leaving the house, right?
Right.
And the concern isn't just economic, it's other things as well. But so I think there's going to be some small changes on products, but brands I don't think are going to change. I think what brands do in this situation can help brands and can hurt brands depending on how they react. I mean, there's well documented data on what happens to brands post crisis based on what they do in the crisis. Kantar has a lot of data on this, and what they've shown is that brands that actually invest and engage with consumers during a crisis grow 9 times faster coming out of the crisis than brands that don't. So, there's a lot of, I think, known guidance for brands, but I don't think brand behavior is going to change so much.
And what about any of these kind of, sort of human strivings, perhaps let's call it that way? So are people revisiting fundamentally the value of things, the value of an education, or the nature and availability of work? There are certain sort of givens, or even where they live and what home represents. It feels to me like if things were changing, they would be sort of at that level. Not necessarily whether everyone's going to go eat out of restaurants again and
Yeah.
Untapped pent up demand, but just really
Yeah.
almost life stage questions.
Fundamental changes.
Fundamental changes. Yeah.
From what I've seen in the data, the answer is not yet. I mean, I think most people have been on lockdown now. Again, this is April 17th, about 5 weeks.
Right.
If things start reopening in 2 to 3 weeks, I don't think we're going to see fundamental changes. I think the snap back to the crisis behaviors are going to be pretty quick, and I think people are pining for it in some way. But if this lasts longer, if this lasts 2, 3, 4 months, God forbid it's 8, 9, 10 months, then I think we're going to start to see some fundamental changes in how people just engage with each other, with things that matter to them, in how they think about life and their place in the world.
Right.
But I think it's all going to depend on how long the quarantine lasts.
And I guess how deleterious the damage done already
Yeah.
is. Yeah. So we're looking at numbers 5, 10 plus million people jobless, and some of, if not many of those jobs might not be recreated for many months, many years potentially, in industry, and that would seem, it seems like that might cast a very different shadow or pall over how people are making some of these important life choices.
But
So
again, I'm not so sure if the economy started to start up 5 days from now, I think of the vast majority of those jobs would come back. I think it's this staged approach, which I do think is the right approach. It's all about how quickly this can get restarted. And I'm not taking a side on that, but I think the quicker it restarts, the less lingering effects we're going to see and the less fundamental consumer behavior change we're going to see.
Right, right. And then let's turn the attention a little bit to the question of trust in media, trust in the company you work for, trust in ourselves. That seemed to be like a very interesting finding.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of work. Obviously, Edelman does a lot of work with their trust barometer, and there's certainly a lot of insight about this shift towards perhaps away from some of the more traditional institutions towards companies. Ironically, looking to companies to provide some kind of anchor, or at least holding them accountable, to act with more purpose. It's a thing we've been talking about for a while in marketing. Any insights about, whether you think perhaps that's been accelerated, changed, we should think about that differently?
I think from the data I've seen, and again, I looked at some Kantar data on this, trust in brands has been declining for about 15 years now, with a pretty steady pace. And it's interesting, I, just trying to be provocative, charted the decline in brand trust to the rise in usage of social media right now. Not necessarily, a cause and effect, although I think there probably is, but it's a perfect inverse correlation of the two. And, I think if you think about pre-social media, obviously there were a limited number of places to get information. And when you democratize that kind of information, the thing we never thought about when we created social media is confirmation bias, right? That we would seek out information that supports our own point of view. And social media is perfect for that, right? So I can create my own little filter bubble of the stuff that makes me feel good about stuff. I was just reading today on what makes some people more prone to conspiracy theories than other people.
Right.
And they said it's a lack of trust in institutions and government, and over indexing in confirmation bias and the desire to find information that uh, validates themselves, right? Um, so from a brand point of view, I think the erosion of brand trust is a difficult and dangerous thing that brands have to think about what that means. Um, and one way to gain the trust of people is to kind of do the right thing in a situation that we're in now, right? And we have a lot of our clients asking us what they should be saying, what they should be doing, and they know like that there's three things they need to be thinking about. How much should I be spending on marketing during this period? What message should I put out there in that marketing? And what should I be doing in the community? And quite honestly, of those three, it's the third one that I think has the biggest impact in building brand trust. I remember when Hurricane Katrina happened, um, and Walmart at the time, uh, I'm not sure how many people remember that period, but at that time, Walmart was coming under a significant amount of fire for the way they treated their employees, the way they treated suppliers, their carbon footprint. They were getting in trouble left, right, and center. And during Katrina, they loaded up, I don't even remember the number, dozens of tractor trailer trucks with their goods and services that they thought people in New Orleans would need, and just drove them down there. They
Hmm.
didn't put out a PR release about it. They didn't
Right.
talk about it. They just did the right thing.
Hmm.
And the press ended up picking up on it. And I remember that was like the turning point for them, with people developing a strong, strong brand affinity for the Walmart brand. And it's just those kind of acts that feel, again, not about the brand. I was just on a call with a client now where we were talking about, messaging in this moment should not be about the brand. It should be about the people and what people are
Right.
feeling. They don't want to
Right.
hear about your brand. They don't give a damn about your brand. They
Right.
want to know how can you help us? And that's what Walmart did, and it was brilliant. And I think that's the way. So brand purpose, I guess is what I'm saying, is a way that brands can recapture that trust.
And is your sense, Mark, that even brands perhaps who hadn't established that ahead of time are able to navigate, or are we really seeing some, settling of the wheat from the chaff? Is it, is it sort of the strongs getting stronger and the weak getting weaker, or are you beginning to see perhaps some brands who have figured this out quickly and started to push in the right direction anyway?
It's interesting because we talk about brand purpose a lot, and when I think about brand purpose, I think about two types of brands. There are brands that are born of a purpose. So if you think of Tom's of Maine, it's sort of like if or Patagonia, if it wasn't for the purpose, the product and the company would not exist, right? Or they wouldn't be making apparel; they'd be making something else. Didn't matter. But it was the purpose that was the core. And then there are brands that have been very commercially focused and only lately have come to purpose as a way of operating their business. And I think there are examples of some brands in that latter bucket that have done a really good job at doing that, and others that have stumbled. And to me, it all comes down to authenticity and genuineness, right? I mean, consumers nowadays are more sophisticated than ever before, and they can sniff out BS quicker than anything else. And when it feels disingenuous and when it feels commercial, it doesn't work for people. But when it feels authentic and real, which again is kind of what Walmart did in Katrina, um, you get rewarded for that. And so I think brands can do it. It's a matter of how they do it and how much they believe in it when they do it.
And then this idea about us as individuals, and if there were some silver linings, again, let's spend a little bit of time and sort of look backwards and ask ourselves, during the time of Sandy or during outbreaks of SARS and MERS and other events, which not of all of which, of course, were as widespread, or here
Hmm.
in America, and particularly in the Northeast, etc., with things like with 9/11, there was a lot of conversation and discussion and virtuous sort of commitment to helping each other, building stronger communities, etc. Maybe a flight from the cities to the suburbs for safety, etc. But it seemed to me not that long before people's behavior reverted. And so again, asking you to sort of look backwards a bit, do you think that is that a fair analysis of what happened in the past, or perhaps did things shift more than I realized? And perhaps is this just a very different kind of experience, given that it's global, happening to us all at one time? And so
You mean
what do we learn from the
about
past?
the individual self?
Yeah, the individual self. So, there was this deep commitment to each other, which was, I think, very much characterized. It was in popular music. It was,
Yeah,
it was in all of the, sort of pop psychology, that after 9/11, for example, we'd all be stronger neighbors and better friends
yeah.
and, more virtuous people. I'm not sure that really played itself out in society or politics
Yeah,
or
I think it
anywhere,
had a
really.
short shelf life. Um, it's really interesting. I was talking to a number of my colleagues in Southeast Asia right before uh, the outbreaks started to accumulate here in the US. And they all said the same thing. They said, "You guys don't know what you're in for." They
Mm,
said, here in Asian countries, um, we're much more about we than
right,
me. And when something like this happens and the government comes in and says, we need to do X, Y, and Z, people fall in line and they
right,
do that for the greater we. He said, you Western countries that are all about the individual, he goes, you guys are going to get your butts kicked by this. And they were right. It's like there's this sense of, don't tell me what to do.
right,
Oh, you're trying to save my life, right? So yeah, I don't know. I think uh, this country and a lot of Western European countries are very much about individualism, and I think at certain times. But if you look at the political climate right now is about isolationism. So it's sort of a retrenchment away from we. Um, so I think sometimes we matters, and I don't think it necessarily has a shelf life. I think we always sort of revert back to this innate sense of individual, I can do it, I am going to do it on my own kind of thing.
right. I've been wondering too, Mark, maybe it's a slightly far-fetched thought or analogy, but whether what might happen is a sort of faint echo or a sort of second, sort of an aftershock wave of the big reaction against globalism. So
Mm,
meaning it seemed to me that what many of us have felt on the have seen on the political sphere, even globally, as this
yeah,
reaction against globalism, and we see it with brands where there's a sort of shift towards localism and celebrating, local ingredients and local
local
breweries or
cultures, yeah,
whatever, local cultures more generally, and sometimes based on some very, sort of good, healthy aspirations, both economic and even medical, but that's been the sort of very strong reaction against globalism. But one wonders whether now there's a little bit of a boomerang, maybe, which is to
yeah,
say, well, you know what, maybe we need these large governments and big institutions to step in and help us out, because as resourceful as we are, it's clear we're not going to, beat these things without a
yeah,
lot of
yeah.
um, collective activity. If there was a sort of what do they call it, the Overton window in politics, where there are certain topics which are or are not sort of suitable for political
Yeah, yeah.
discourse at any period of time. Maybe that shifted a bit. I mean, that
It's an
any
interesting
evidence you
point.
see?
Yeah. Uh, I don't know, because I think there are two forces working against each other right now. So there is a sense of close the borders and keep problems like this out.
Right.
But at the same time, there's a sensibility that we can't do it on our own, and
Mm.
we actually need the help of the companies that are in China and India and
Right.
Vietnam producing these materials.
Right.
And it's sort of an unrealistic economic expectation that we're going to bring a lot of this manufacturing back here. I just think it's unrealistic
Yep.
because I don't think the average consumer is going to be willing to pay 3-4 times the price that they've been accustomed to. So it's a weird time. I mean, it's an interesting point you're bringing up, but it feels like there's a tension between globalism and isolationism
Right.
that are
Right.
coming to a head, and I'm not sure where it's going to fall out.
No. Well, I think it's definitely a tension to explore, which I mean, obviously makes
Yeah,
it interesting. The other question is, and I'm not sure if you picked up some of this in your data, is, and I'm not quite sure what the starting point was, but the idea of the expert. So there was
yeah,
obviously a lot of push, in our political sphere as much as anywhere against sort of the expert, or a belief of sort of more rugged individualism, and a sort of belief that we're as smart as the experts, and we shouldn't listen to the experts, or the experts perhaps, or the elites more broadly, had got us into trouble in the first
yeah.
place. Do you think maybe, again, I'm positing that this crisis perhaps redresses that balance a little bit, and people recognize that, again, this is a problem which really actually requires expertise, and you might want to put yourself in the hands of the experts.
I'd
Any
like to
evidence of
think
that?
that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen. And again, I don't want to, jump all over social media, but the allure of social media is so
Right.
strong. And to me, social media is really about democratizing information and knowledge, and not being necessarily about the experts, but being about all of us. Um, I would like to think that's going to happen. The data wouldn't say that that's it, right? I mean, the
Right.
fact that when we say who's going to get us through this, individuals come out small level, but higher than the CDC. I mean, I think if
Right.
you did this survey 30 years ago,
Yeah.
CDC would be at the top and
Yep.
individuals would
Yep.
be halfway down the list. So
Yep.
I think it's a deeper cultural issue
Hmm.
that even something like this is not big enough to undo.
Yep. I think somewhere in the mix is this emerging idea of sort of citizen journalism and citizen data
Mm,
science and citizen data visualization. I think, as you know, I'm fascinated by that world. I heard this morning that the FT, which has a very famous data visualization tracking
yeah,
on a log scale, the expansion of the disease, cumulative expansion of the disease, is the number one. It's the most frequented page on the FT
yeah,
ever.
yeah,
They've
yeah,
never had, they've never
yeah,
had so much traffic, and it's taken on the author of that data visualization has talked sort of about his own personal responsibility,
yeah,
to sort of keep this story alive, and how many people rely on it now. Arguably, he's trained as a journalist, so he's not just a duffer, throwing numbers up. But he's not the only one that we know folks are following, or that have created these very
yep,
powerful places where data is aggregated and examined. And I found that quite fascinating, that we had allowed into our dialogue the opinions of others, the informed opinions of others, let's put it
yeah,
that way. That felt maybe somewhere in between,
yeah.
elites and one of us, sort of thing.
I mean, you and I have talked about this, and I talk about this in my class a lot, that, data is just data,
Right.
right? The expert ability to extract meaning and insight from it
Yep.
is an art that
Yep.
requires an expert to do that. And I think, the danger of publishing all this data, and I'll point back to the polling companies that all got uh, Trump Clinton wrong, that, when you try and boil data down too easy, to make it too accessible, it loses its potency in
Hmm.
a way. Who's the guy from the 538 blog?
Nate Silver.
Nate Silver. So I thought, and I think he's brilliant and I'm a fan, but I think he did people a great disservice by trying to boil down the election to probabilities. We know people are bad at probabilities. You can tell
Hmm.
that every time the lottery amount goes up and everyone goes out and buys a ticket, but they won't buy it. The probabilities haven't changed,
Yeah,
just
yeah,
this number, right? Um, and he tried to boil down the probability of Clinton winning and the probability of Trump winning. Um, and I think it confused people and may have suppressed some votes
right.
on one side. So I think we need to be careful with what we
Yeah.
do with data, you know?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I could not agree more. Although I'm slightly heartened by the fact that I think this may be a bit of a pivot point for data visualization and
Yes.
data user data science, and up to and including the fact that people seem quite comfortable reading charts that have log scales and are charting probabilistic outcomes.
Yeah.
These are those sort of conversations about the spread of a future curve in the course are conversations typically that perhaps are not happening in the public media as
Yeah.
much, and yet you've got, and again I'm wondering whether represents some sort of shift a little bit towards as people are experiencing products, thinking about products, thinking about the information about what goes into their products, where they've got, all this sort of
Yeah.
information. Again, that often we kind of have said, hey, too much cognitive load.
Yeah.
I'm not going to deal with that. It's a brand I know and love, but perhaps there's a capacity, at least now, for people to say, hey, I've got some tools to think about these things differently. So,
And it's not, as you know, it's not dichotomous, right? It's not, are
right,
people going to
right.
do this or not?
Yeah,
It's how many people are going to do
yeah,
this or not, right?
yeah,
So I think your point is well taken. And what you may see is before, if that was a tiny little segment of the market,
right.
it'll be a bigger section of the market, and it could be, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the benefits of
Mm,
consumerism and social media, is that it's they companies can't pull the wool over your eyes anymore, right?
right,
We
right,
have a
right.
peek behind the curtain, and
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
call BS when we see it.
yeah,
So yeah, maybe that is a thing, and it's just a matter of to what degree will it be happening.
yeah. Excellent. Well, any sort of closing thoughts? Any other good counsel that you're leaving your clients with in terms of what they should be doing now, or what they should be thinking of? Perhaps even reflections of your own on leadership. You've observed leaders in lots of different forums, acting and behaving, and wonder if you sort of have generated any thoughts about how we should be leading in a time like
Um,
this.
I look at the bosses in the group I work in, and they've been phenomenal, balancing the needs of the business and caring about the people,
Mm,
and I mean genuinely caring about the people, not reading it off a pre-printed press release or something, but really you get the sense that they really care about the human part of this. um, and I think that's the balance, right, that any leader has to strike. There are economic realities, but this is a tough time for people, and we have to be cognizant of that. And I think it's the same thing with brands. I mean, my advice for brands is, what do you think your mother would want you to do
mm,
as a steward of a brand? What's the
mm.
right thing to do
Right,
today? And
right.
just go do that, and it will pay back for you.
Yeah. Okay, that's a fabulous place to end. I really appreciate your time, Mark, and look forward to some other conversations. But once again, want to thank Mark Truss for joining us today, and for a fascinating conversation and some really, I think, insightful data, which I'm sure we'll see more of from Wunderman Thompson. So many thanks, Mark.
Good to be here, and I enjoyed the chat.
All right, so I will stop the recording. See how